The morning air at the Wehrmacht testing facility near Hillersleben hung cold and still on the 3rd of November, 1944. Oberst Klaus Hartmann stood behind the firing line, field glasses in hand, watching his gun crew make final adjustments to the captured American artillery piece. The weapon stretched before him like some industrial sculpture, a barrel, so long it seemed to defy structural logic, mounted on a carriage that spoke to American engineering philosophy, heavy, robust, built for punishment rather than elegance. Hartmann had tested captured equipment for 3 years, Soviet guns that surprised him with their crude effectiveness, British artillery that demonstrated clever design, compromises. But this American piece, designated Muno by its makers and called Long Tom by the soldiers who served it, represented something different. The preliminary measurements suggested it shouldn't work as well as American firing reports claimed. Recoil mechanism too simple, the whole assembly too straightforward for exceptional performance. Ready to fire, Herr Oberst, the gun captain called. Hartmann nodded. Downrange, at carefully measured intervals. Observation posts waited with telephone connections to report impact locations. The standard test protocol, verify what the weapon could actually do against what its design suggested it should do. Usually, captured weapons performed slightly below their theoretical specifications. Battlefield wear, mismatched ammunition, the chaos of combat recovery all took their toll. The gun fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the proving ground. The recoil was substantial but controlled, the entire carriage sliding backwards smoothly before the recuperator springs drew it forward again. Hartmann started his stopwatch, counting the seconds until impact. The telephone at his elbow rattled. Impact observed, Herr Oberst. 23 kilometers, bearing 271 degrees. Hartmann lowered his field glasses slowly. 23 kilometers. Over 14 miles. He had calculated expected performance based on barrel length and projectile weight, perhaps 12 or 13 kilometers, comparable to Germany's better field pieces. 23 kilometers put this weapon in a different category entirely. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Verify, Hartmann said quietly into the telephone. Confirmed, Herr Oberst. 23.2 kilometers. Clear impact crater. Standard high-explosive round. The implications rippled outward from that single number like shockwaves from the shell itself. If American forces deployed these guns in quantity and intelligence reports suggested they had hundreds of them, they could reach targets that German artillery couldn't touch. They could sit comfortably beyond German counter-battery range, methodically destroying targets with impunity. The entire calculus of artillery duels, of counter-battery fire, of defensive positioning, shifted with that 14-mile reach. But the deeper question, the one that would haunt Hartmann through the coming months as Germany's military situation deteriorated from critical to catastrophic, was simpler and more disturbing. If the Americans could build artillery this capable, and build it in such numbers, what else had German intelligence gotten wrong about American military power? In the autumn of 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and set in motion the catastrophic machinery of the Second World War, German artillery doctrine represented the pinnacle of decades of careful development. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped Germany of its heavy weapons after the First World War, but it couldn't erase the institutional knowledge, the mathematical principles, the accumulated expertise of the German artillery tradition. When rearmament began in earnest in the mid-1930s, German designers brought forward that expertise, creating weapons that balanced mobility, firepower, and precision. The backbone of German field artillery remained the 10.5-centimeter light field howitzer, the Leifh-18, capable of firing a 14.5-kilogram shell out to roughly 11 kilometers. The Leifh-18 equipped nearly every German division. It was reliable, reasonably mobile when towed by half-track or truck, and accurate enough for the quick, violent artillery preparations that characterized German offensive doctrine. German gunners trained extensively in direct support of infantry and armor, learning to deliver fire rapidly and then displace before enemy counter-battery fire arrived. Complementing the LFH-Diachocho was the 15-centimeter heavy field howitzer, the SFH-Diachocho, which could reach targets at 13 kilometers with a 43-kilogram shell. Heavier, less mobile, but devastating when properly employed. German artillery tables were comprehensive, accounting for atmospheric conditions, powder temperature, barrel wear, projectile variation. Forward observers trained to adjust fire with mathematical precision, walking rounds onto target with minimal expenditure of ammunition. And then there was the 88. The 88mm flak gun had achieved legendary status even before the war began. Designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, its high muzzle velocity and flat trajectory made it devastatingly effective against tanks. During the campaign in France in 1940, German commanders discovered that the 88 could penetrate the armor of any Allied tank at ranges where return fire was ineffective. In North Africa, Rommel used 88s to anchor his defensive positions, creating kill zones that British armor entered at their peril. But the 88's versatility extended to traditional artillery roles as well, when employed in indirect fire. It could reach targets at approximately 15 kilometers, not exceptional for a gun of its size, but adequate for most tactical situations. The 88's reputation derived not from any single exceptional characteristic, but from its combination of capabilities: anti-tank, anti-aircraft, and field artillery roles in one weapon system. Hermann artillery officers like Klaus Hartmann had spent their careers mastering these weapons and the doctrine surrounding them. Hartmann had joined the Wehrmacht in 1934, trained at the artillery school in Jüterbog, served in Poland, France, and the first years of the Russian campaign. He understood artillery not as abstract theory, but as applied mathematics under fire, the science of predicting where a shell would land based on elevation, charge, wind, temperature, and a dozen other variables that could turn a perfect firing solution into a miss by hundreds of meters. The German approach emphasized efficiency. Ammunition was valuable, transportation was constrained, industrial capacity was limited. German gunners learned to achieve their effects with minimal expenditure, to make every shell count. This wasn't just doctrine, it was necessity. Germany lacked the raw material abundance of larger powers. Steel, copper, explosives, all were carefully allocated, rationed among competing military needs. Artillery ammunition competed with tank production, aircraft manufacture, small arms production, and every other demand of total war. This efficiency extended to design philosophy. German weapons were precisely engineered, often incorporating clever mechanical solutions to complex problems. The SFH-Diachocho, for example, used a sophisticated recoil system that allowed the barrel to slide along the cradle, reducing stress on the carriage. German optical sights were superb, manufactured to tolerances that maximized accuracy. Fire control systems were comprehensive, enabling rapid calculation of firing solutions, even under battlefield conditions. But precision engineering came with costs. German weapons often required skilled maintenance, specialized tools, careful handling. They were not designed for mass production by semi-skilled workers or operation by hastily trained crews. They were craftsmen's weapons, built for professional soldiers who understood their capabilities and limitations. By 1944, this approach to warfare faced increasing strain. On the Eastern Front, Soviet artillery had demonstrated that overwhelming volume could compensate for individual imprecision. Our Katyusha rocket barrage lacked the accuracy of German tube artillery, but when hundreds of rockets saturated an area simultaneously, accuracy became less relevant. Soviet gunners fired preparation barrages that consumed ammunition at rates that made German officers wince thousands of rounds expended in hours, creating a maelstrom of steel that pulverized defensive positions, regardless of how well constructed they were. British artillery doctrine emphasized careful, methodical fire, not the overwhelming barrages of the Soviets, but precisely coordinated shoots that integrated infantry, armor, and artillery into combined arms operations. British gunners were professionals, their forward observers well trained, their fire control systems sophisticated. German officers respected British artillery, even if they didn't always fear it. American artillery, however, remained something of a question mark through the early years of the war. Sherman intelligence knew the Americans were producing vast quantities of weapons. The production figures were simply too large to ignore entirely. But quantity didn't necessarily mean quality. The prevailing assumption in German military circles characterized American forces as industrially powerful but tactically unsophisticated. They had machines, certainly, but supposedly lacked the battlefield experience and military tradition of European armies. This assumption was reinforced by German experiences in North Africa and Italy. American forces had demonstrated courage and determination, but they'd also made mistakes, tactical errors that German commanders attributed to inexperience rather than capability. American artillery in Tunisia and Sicily had been effective, but not overwhelmingly so. The general assessment among Wehrmacht officers was that American forces relied on material superiority to compensate for tactical deficiencies. "They'll throw 1,000 shells, where we would place 50, was a common observation in German officer circles. This wasn't entirely dismissive. It acknowledged American advantages in production and logistics, but it carried an implicit assumption that German tactical skill and weapon quality would partially offset American numerical superiority. Klaus Hartmann shared these assumptions. He had read intelligence reports on American artillery, studied captured equipment from Tunisia and Sicily. The standard American field piece was the 105mm howitzer designated MDOS. It was a solid weapon, reliable, reasonably accurate, with a maximum range of about 11 kilometers, comparable to the German Leipzig 18, perhaps slightly better in some respects, but not dramatically superior. The Americans had built thousands of them, which was impressive, but the weapon itself didn't suggest any revolutionary advance in artillery technology. Hartmann knew the Americans also fielded heavier guns. Intelligence reports mentioned 155mm pieces, both howitzers and guns. The howitzers were comparable to German 15cm weapons, useful for general support but not exceptional. The guns were described as long-range pieces, but without specific performance data, Hartmann assumed they were similar to German equivalents, capable but specialized, requiring significant logistical support, produced in limited numbers for specific missions. When Hartmann received orders in early October of 1944 to prepare for testing captured American artillery at Hillersleben, he approached the assignment with professional curiosity rather than urgency. Testing captured equipment was routine. It helped German forces understand enemy capabilities, identify potential weaknesses, occasionally provided insights for domestic weapon development. But Hartmann expected to confirm what intelligence reports already suggested, that American artillery was well made but conventional, powerful but not revolutionary. The captured pieces arrived by rail from France, where German forces had retreated following the Allied breakout from Normandy. The chaotic fighting of summer and fall, 1944, had left scattered equipment across the French countryside. Vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel. Guns left behind when units withdrew faster than they could move heavy equipment. Supply dumps captured intact when defensive lines collapsed. Among the recovered items were several American artillery pieces, including 2 examples of the Muno 155mm gun, the Long Tom, as American soldiers apparently called it. Hartmann's initial inspection of the weapon confirmed his expectations of American design philosophy. The gun was big, over 13,000 kilograms in firing position, requiring a substantial tractor to move. The barrel stretched nearly 7 meters, giving the entire assembly an almost ungainly appearance. The carriage was heavy, over-engineered in the German view, with components that seemed larger than strictly necessary. Built like their automobiles, Hartmann's chief engineer commented. Everything oversized, overbuilt, probably very reliable, but wasteful of materials. The breech mechanism was straightforward, an interrupted screw design, identical in principle to what German guns used. The recoil system used hydropneumatic cylinders, again conventional. The sighting equipment was adequate, but not exceptional. The whole weapon spoke to a design philosophy that prioritized ease of production and field maintenance over optimization of every component. Where German designers might spend months perfecting a mechanism to save a few kilograms of weight or squeeze out an extra percentage point of efficiency, American designers apparently settled for good enough and moved to production. The results were weapons that worked reliably, could be manufactured quickly, and didn't require highly skilled crews to operate. This wasn't necessarily inferior, in fact. For mass production and field service, it had distinct advantages. But it suggested to Hartmann and his colleagues that American weapons would be competent rather than excellent, that they would rely on quantity and logistical support rather than technical superiority. The Long Tom's ammunition reinforced this impression. The shells were large, 95 pounds, significantly heavier than anything German field artillery typically fired. They were well made, with consistent machining and good quality control, but nothing about them suggested exotic metallurgy or revolutionary design. Standard high-explosive rounds, with copper driving bands and impact fuses. The propellant charges came in several increments, allowing gunners to adjust range by varying the amount of powder used again. Standard practice. Hartmann's team spent several days examining the captured guns, measuring dimensions, checking tolerances, and documenting every aspect of their design. They calculated theoretical performance based on barrel length, chamber volume, and projectile weight. The math suggested the Long Tom should be capable of reaching targets at 12, maybe 13 kilometers, roughly comparable to the German SFH 18, perhaps slightly better due to the longer barrel and heavier projectile. 13 kilometers would be respectable. It would mean American forces had a capable long-range gun, useful for deep interdiction and counter-battery fire, but it wouldn't fundamentally alter the tactical situation. German guns could respond, even if at slightly reduced range. The 88, when used in indirect fire, could nearly match that performance. On the morning of November 3, 1944, Hartmann's crew prepared the Long Tom for its first live fire test. The proving ground at Hillersleben offered optimal conditions: flat terrain, clear sight lines, permanent observation posts at measured distances out to 25 kilometers. The weather was acceptable, cold but clear, with minimal wind. Atmospheric conditions were carefully logged: temperature, barometric pressure, humidity, all the variables that affected ballistic calculations. The gun crew consisted of experienced German artillerymen who had been trained on the captured weapon using American technical manuals translated by intelligence services. The manuals were comprehensive, detailing loading procedures, maintenance requirements, safety protocols. American military documentation was consistently thorough, if sometimes overly detailed, written apparently for crews with minimal technical background, explaining procedures that German gunners would consider self-evident. Hartmann positioned himself at the primary observation post, field glasses ready, stopwatch in hand. Telephone connections linked him to observation posts downrange, each manned by personnel with spotting scopes and range-finding equipment. The target area, an open section of the proving ground, marked with aiming stakes, waited empty. Load standard high explosive, charge 7, Hartmann ordered. Charge 7 represented the maximum propellant load specified in the American manual, the configuration that should produce maximum range. The crew loaded the 95-pound projectile, then the powder charge. The gun captain checked the elevation 45 degrees, the optimal angle for maximum range. He made a final adjustment to the traverse, lining up the sight on the aiming point. Ready to fire, Herr Oberst. Hartmann glanced at his watch, noting the time. Fire when ready. The lanyard pulled. The gun roared, and in that moment, as the shell arched upward into the November sky, as the recoil system absorbed the tremendous energy of firing and smoothly returned the gun to battery, as Hartmann started counting the seconds until impact, German assumptions about American artillery began their collision with uncomfortable reality. The first impact report came within 30 seconds, 23.2 kilometers. Hartmann requested confirmation, assuming an error in measurement or communication. The confirmation came back identical. Our second round, fired with the same settings, landed at 23.4 kilometers. A third reached 23.1. The pattern was consistent. The Long Tom wasn't capable of 13 kilometers, as German calculations had predicted. It was reaching nearly 23.5 kilometers over 14.5 miles. That put it roughly 9 kilometers beyond the maximum effective range of Germany's standard heavy field howitzer. It outranged the legendary 88 by more than 8 kilometers. Only Germany's truly heavy artillery, the massive 17-centimeter pieces, the rail-mounted siege guns could match or exceed that range. And those weapons were strategic assets, not tactical artillery that could be towed behind a truck and deployed by a standard gun crew. Hartmann stood at the observation post, watching his crew prepare another test round, and felt the first stirrings of something that would grow over the coming months into a profound unease. This wasn't just a capably artillery piece. This was a weapon that fundamentally altered the tactical geometry of artillery combat, and if American forces had deployed hundreds of them, intelligence reports suggested they had then German artillery faced an opponent with a decisive range advantage. But the implications extended beyond mere range. Hartmann had spent 20 years in artillery. He understood what it took to build a gun capable of such performance. Precise metallurgy for the barrel, sophisticated ballistics calculations for the shell design, quality propellants manufactured to consistent specifications, careful engineering of the recoil and recuperator systems. The Long Tom wasn't a fluke or a handcrafted prototype. It was a production weapon built in factories by industrial workers, designed for field service by adequately trained crews, which meant American industry could manufacture weapons of genuine technical excellence, not just in small numbers as experimental pieces, but at mass production scale. The comfortable assumption that American forces relied on quantity over quality, that they compensated for technical deficiencies with material abundance, was beginning to look like a dangerous miscalculation. Over the following week, Hartmann's team conducted comprehensive testing of both captured Long Tom guns. They fired at various elevations, tested different powder charges, experimented with the multiple propellant increments the American system allowed. They measured muzzle velocity using chronographic equipment, finding that the Long Tom propelled its 95-pound projectiles at velocities approaching 850 meters per second, substantially faster than comparable German guns, achieved with similar weight shells. The accuracy proved equally impressive. At ranges exceeding 20 kilometers, the Long Tom placed rounds within a 50-meter radius, with consistency that suggested excellent manufacturing tolerances. The barrel showed no excessive wear, despite the high velocities involved. The recoil system performed flawlessly through dozens of firing cycles. Even the carriage, which had seemed overly heavy during initial inspection, demonstrated its purpose. It provided a stable firing platform that didn't require extensive preparation or ground reinforcement. Hartmann documented everything meticulously. Barrel temperature after sustained firing sequences, recoil travel distance, time required for a trained crew to prepare the weapon for action, rate of fire under various conditions. Every measurement went into his report, building a comprehensive picture of the weapon's capabilities. But numbers alone couldn't capture what troubled Hartmann most. He had tested captured weapons before Soviet, British, French, even earlier American pieces. There was always something that explained exceptional performance. Soviet guns were simple but limited in other ways. British weapons showed clever engineering but were often complex to maintain. Captured equipment frequently arrived damaged or with mismatched ammunition or missing critical components. It was simply, straightforwardly, exceptionally good at what it was designed to do. The Americans had identified a requirement, long-range fire support for course-level operations, and had engineered a weapon that fulfilled that requirement with remarkable effectiveness. Then they'd manufactured it in quantity sufficient to equip multiple units across multiple theaters of operation. Hartmann's preliminary report submitted to Oberkommando des Heeres in mid-November, attempted to convey these findings objectively. But he also included a section that went beyond pure technical analysis. The captured American Muno gun demonstrates performance characteristics that exceed our previous assessments of enemy artillery capabilities. More significantly, the weapons design philosophy reveals a synthesis of technical excellence and mass production methodology that our intelligence estimates may have undervalued. The enemy has achieved both quality and quantity in artillery production, a combination we believed incompatible with rapid industrial expansion. The report circulated through German Artillery Command, reaching officers who were grappling with more immediate crises: fuel shortages, crippling mobility, ammunition rationing, forcing careful shot selection, the steady erosion of experienced gun crews as casualties mounted and replacements arrived with minimal training. Technical analyses of captured equipment competed for attention with operational emergencies, but some officers read Hartmann's report carefully. Among them was Major Friedrich Weber, who had commanded artillery observation units in Normandy and had direct experience with American fire support in combat conditions. Weber had survived the Normandy fighting, the desperate retreat across France, the chaotic withdrawal to the German border. His unit had been shattered multiple times, reconstituted with replacements, shattered again. Through those months of defensive combat, Weber had developed a grudging respect for American artillery, not because any single barrage was particularly exceptional, but because of the relentless, systematic nature of American fire support. American forward observers seemed to be everywhere, calling down fire with minimal delay. American fire direction centers coordinated dozens of batteries simultaneously, creating precisely timed barrages that suppressed German positions before infantry attacks, isolated counter-attacking forces, interdicted supply routes. The volume was staggering. American units expended ammunition at rates that Weber, trained in German efficiency doctrine, found almost incomprehensible. Weber had attributed much of this to American logistical advantages. Operating from Normandy with relatively short supply lines, American forces could afford profligacy that German forces, constrained by disrupted railways and constant air attack, could never match. He'd assumed the weapons themselves were adequate, but not exceptional, that American effectiveness derived from material abundance rather than technical superiority. Hartmann's report on the Long Tom challenged that assumption directly. If American artillery could reach targets 8 or 9 kilometers beyond German guns' maximum range, then American forces controlled a substantial zone around their positions where they could strike with impunity. German counter-battery fire, which relied on quickly identifying enemy gun positions and responding before they displaced, became ineffective when German guns couldn't reach the American batteries in the first place. Weber requested a visit to Hillersleben to observe the Long Tom firsthand. He arrived on a cold morning in late November, bringing with him firing reports from his experiences in France, documents that listed American artillery concentrations, estimated battery locations, observed fire effects. He wanted to see if the Long Tom's capabilities matched what he'd experienced in combat. Hartmann welcomed Weber's visit. Testing equipment in laboratory conditions provided data, but combat veterans could offer context how weapons actually performed under battlefield stress, how doctrine shaped their employment, what tactical implications emerged in real operations. They spent the morning reviewing test data, comparing American and German artillery tables, discussing firing procedures. Weber examined the Long Tom's ammunition, hefting the 95-pound shells, studying the propellant charges. "We captured some of these in France," Weber said. "I assumed they were from heavy howitzers. It didn't occur to me they came from a mobile gun. The Americans apparently deploy them at corps level," Hartmann explained. "Intelligence reports suggest they have dedicated battalions, 12 guns per battalion, organized specifically for deep fire support and counter-battery missions." Weber did the mathematics in his head. 12 guns, each capable of reaching 23 kilometers, firing in coordinated shoots. The effective area such a battery could cover the number of German positions that could be subjected to fire from beyond response range. "We have nothing comparable," he said quietly. "Not in mobile artillery. Our long-range weapons are either siege pieces or rail-mounted." They walked out to the firing line, where one of the long toms sat prepared for a demonstration shoot. Weber had requested a full-fire mission simulation, plotting targets, calculating firing data, executing the mission as an American battery might in combat. Hartmann's crew had prepared accordingly. The demonstration proceeded with the methodical precision of a training exercise. Target coordinates were plotted. Firing data was calculated using captured American fire tables. The gun was laid on the target bearing. At Weber's command, the crew fired. The recoil, the sharp crack of the gun, the smooth return to battery all proceeded exactly as Hartmann's previous tests had demonstrated. Weber watched through field glasses as, 30 seconds later, the observation post reported impact within 50 meters of the target point. Again, Weber ordered, "New target, maximum range." The crew adjusted elevation and bearing. The gun fired. This time, the shell traveled its full range, landing at 23.4 kilometers, 14.5 miles from the firing position. Weber lowered his field glasses slowly. "In France," he said, "American artillery fire would arrive from what seemed like impossible distances. We would identify supposed gun positions, call down our own counter-battery fire, and discover our shells were falling short. We attributed it to faulty intelligence, to errors in position plotting. We didn't consider that. Their guns might simply reach farther than ours." Hartmann nodded. "The range advantage creates a tactical asymmetry. They can engage our batteries while remaining immune to counterfire. They can afford to fire deliberate missions, adjust carefully, because they're beyond our reach." "It changes everything," Weber said. "Artillery doctrine assumes rough parity in range. Forward observers learn to stay outside enemy artillery zones. Counter-battery procedures assume you can reach the enemy guns once you locate them. But if one side has a 4 or 5 kilometer advantage..." He trailed off, the implications too numerous to catalogue quickly. They returned to Hartmann's office, where maps and intelligence reports covered the work table. Weber studied American unit organizations, artillery allocation tables, production estimates. The numbers were remarkable. The Americans had apparently produced over 1,000 long-tom guns by mid-1944, with production continuing at roughly 100 per month, 1,000 guns, each capable of 14-mile range, distributed across multiple theaters, from Europe to the Pacific, supported by ammunition production that measured in the millions of rounds annually. "We knew they were producing substantial quantities," Hartmann said, "but we assumed quantity came at the expense of quality. The long tom suggests that assumption was incorrect." Weber pulled another intelligence document from the pile, a report on American 105mm howitzer production. The MDOS howitzer, standard equipment in American divisions, had been manufactured in quantities exceeding 10,000 pieces. 10,000. Germany's total artillery production across all types, for the entire war, struggled to approach that number for a single weapon system. "How do they manufacture at this scale?" Weber asked. "Our factories are running full shifts. We've mobilized forced labor. We're stripping resources from civilian economy. And still, we can't approach these production rates." Hartmann had been considering this question since the long tom tests began. "I think we've misunderstood the nature of American industry," he said carefully. "We've thought of it as European industry, but larger, more factories producing the same way we produce, just in greater numbers. But perhaps it's fundamentally different. Perhaps they've industrialized the production of weapons in ways we haven't fully grasped." He gestured at the long tom, visible through the window. "Look at how it's designed. Every component is sized for machine production. The tolerances are good, but not exceptional. They don't require hand-fitting by skilled craftsmen. The design itself is straightforward, with minimal exotic materials or complex mechanisms. It's engineered for assembly line production by semi-skilled workers. And it still performs exceptionally," Weber noted. Exactly. They've achieved technical excellence through different means than we would employ. We would optimize every component, seek maximum efficiency, craft each piece carefully. They design for reproducibility, for maintenance by field crews, for operation by adequately trained soldiers, rather than specialists. And somehow, this approach produces weapons that match or exceed ours in the measurements that matter most. Weber was quiet for a moment, studying the production figures. If they can do this with artillery, what does it imply about tanks, aircraft, ships? It was the question that had troubled Hartmann since the first test firing. The Long Tom was just one weapon system. If American industry could produce exceptional artillery at mass scale, the implications extended across every domain of military production. And indeed, intelligence reports suggested similar patterns elsewhere. American tank production measured in tens of thousands annually. Aircraft production exceeded German output by factors of 3 or 4 to 1. Construction, particularly merchant vessels, proceeded at rates that seemed to violate basic industrial constraints. German planners had known about American production capacity. In abstract terms, the intelligence estimates existed. The numbers were documented, but there had remained a persistent belief that such massive production must sacrifice quality, that American weapons would be adequate but not excellent, that German technical superiority would compensate for numerical disadvantages. The Long Tom challenged that comfortable assumption directly. Here was a weapon that demonstrated both technical excellence and mass production. And if the pattern held across other weapons systems, Germany faced an enemy who could deploy superior equipment in overwhelming numbers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The strategic implications were profound and deeply troubling. Germany's entire war strategy, from the beginning, had rested on certain assumptions about relative capabilities. German forces would achieve quick victories through tactical superiority and operational excellence. German weapons would be better designed, better manufactured, more effectively employed. German soldiers would be better trained, more experienced, more capable of complex operations. These advantages would offset Allied material superiority, allowing Germany to defeat enemies piecemeal before their combined strength became overwhelming. By late 1944, those assumptions lay in ruins. The quick victories hadn't materialized. The Soviet Union hadn't collapsed in 1941. Britain hadn't surrendered after France fell. The war had metastasized into a global struggle of attrition. German tactical superiority still existed in many domains, but it was being ground down by sheer material pressure. And now, weapons like the Long Tom suggested that even the assumption of German technical excellence was questionable. Weber spent 2 days at Hillersleben, observing tests, reviewing data, discussing implications with Hartmann and his staff. When he returned to his unit in mid-December, his perspective on the war had shifted in subtle but fundamental ways. He no longer viewed American artillery as simply numerous but conventional. He now understood it as technically sophisticated and overwhelmingly abundant, a combination that created tactical problems without obvious solutions. His unit was positioned in defensive works along the Ruhr River, part of the German defensive line trying to contain Allied forces short of the Rhine. American artillery dominated the sector, constant harassing fire, precisely coordinated barrages supporting limited attacks, devastating counter-battery shoots that forced German guns to displace after firing just a few rounds. Weber began tracking the pattern of American fire more carefully, using his knowledge of the Long Tom's capabilities to estimate battery positions. He identified at least 3 Long Tom batteries supporting the American corps opposite his sector, roughly 36 guns positioned in depth beyond the range of German counter-battery fire. They fired deliberate missions at high-value targets, command posts, supply points, artillery positions, observation posts. German forces could do nothing but endure or attempt to hide. The psychological effect on German gun crews was corrosive. Artillery doctrine emphasized aggressive counter-battery fire: locate enemy guns, suppress them, protect your own forces. But when your weapons couldn't reach the enemy batteries, when every firing position drew immediate response fire from unseen American guns, the entire doctrine collapsed. German crews became reluctant to fire at all, knowing that revealing their positions invited destruction they couldn't prevent. Weber documented these effects in his reports, but he knew the information changed nothing. Germany couldn't produce more artillery, couldn't manufacture longer-ranged guns, couldn't match American ammunition expenditure. The industrial disparity wasn't a tactical problem amenable to clever solutions. It was a strategic reality that shaped every engagement, every operation, every desperate defensive stand. In early January of 1945, Weber's sector came under sustained American bombardment as part of the preliminary phase for an offensive. The barrage lasted 6 hours, methodically working over German positions with the systematic thoroughness that characterized American artillery doctrine. Weber's observation post, carefully concealed in the ruins of a village church, was hit by 5mm fire, long tom fire, almost certainly that collapsed the remaining walls and killed 2 of his observers. The shells arrived without warning, bracketing the position with 3 rounds in rapid succession. Weber survived only because he'd been in the church basement checking telephone lines. When he emerged, he found the observation equipment destroyed, the upper floor collapsed, the carefully plotted firing charts buried in rubble. They relocated to an alternate position a kilometer away, but the pattern repeated. American forward observers, likely equipped with radio direction finding equipment, were locating German command posts and calling down fire with disturbing efficiency. The American artillery system observers, fire direction centers, gun batteries, ammunition supply functioned like a vast machine, grinding away at German defensive positions with industrial persistence. Weber watched through field glasses as American shells fell on German artillery positions downrange. The impacts were deliberate, methodical, walking across suspected gun positions in patterns that suggested the Americans were using aerial photographs to plot likely locations. German crews that attempted to return fire drew immediate. Counter-battery response, multiple batteries firing in coordination, dozens of shells arriving nearly simultaneously. The tactical asymmetry was absolute and demoralizing. American artillery could afford to fire exploratory missions, could waste ammunition on suspected positions, could overwhelm defensive zones with sheer volume of fire. German artillery had to be perfect first-round hits, minimal exposure, immediate displacement, because they wouldn't get second chances. And behind it all, Weber now understood, sat the American industrial system that made such profligacy possible. Factories producing thousands of guns. Ammunition plants running 3 shifts, churning out millions of shells. Transportation networks moving supplies from American ports to forward positions with assembly line efficiency. The entire apparatus of modern industrial warfare, operating at a scale that Germany simply couldn't match. It wasn't that German forces were fighting poorly. German gun crews were skilled. German tactics were sophisticated. German equipment, where it functioned and ammunition was available, remained excellent. But skill and sophistication couldn't bridge the material gap. The Long Tom's 14-mile range was just one data point in a larger pattern. American forces possessed both quantitative and qualitative advantages, and those advantages were decisive. By late January, as Soviet forces closed on Berlin from the east and American forces prepared to cross the Rhine in the west, Weber's artillery unit had been reduced to scattered fragments. Ammunition was rationed to a few shells per gun per day. Fuel for prime movers was nearly non-existent, leaving guns immobile. Replacement crews arrived with minimal training, sometimes having fired their weapons only once or twice before deployment. Weber found himself commanding a composite battery guns from 3 different units, crews with no common training, equipment in various states of disrepair. They occupied positions in a forest north of the Ruhr industrial region, tasked with supporting defensive operations that everyone understood were merely delaying the inevitable. On the morning of February 14, 1945, American forces launched a limited offensive in Weber's sector. The preliminary bombardment lasted 90 minutes, during which Weber estimated that several thousand shells fell on German positions in his 2-kilometer-wide sector alone. The guns firing included long toms. He could identify their distinctive sound now, the sharp crack of high-velocity fire, different from the deeper thump of howitzers. His own battery attempted counter-battery fire, but the mathematics were hopeless. His guns, a mix of Leopard-18 howitzers and one surviving SFH-18, could reach perhaps 11 or 12 kilometers. The long tom batteries were positioned at least 15 kilometers back, comfortably beyond response range. His shells fell short, wasted ammunition expended against an enemy who could fire with impunity. The American infantry attack that followed the barrage was almost anticlimactic. German defensive positions had been systematically destroyed, communication lines cut, strong points isolated. The defenders who survived the bombardment fought with characteristic determination, but they were fighting fragments of a battle rather than a coordinated defense. American forces advanced methodically, using their material advantages to minimize casualties while grinding forward against weakened resistance. Weber's command post received orders to withdraw in mid-afternoon. They spiked their remaining guns, driving steel rods down the barrels to render them useless, and retreated on foot, carrying only personal weapons and essential equipment. The guns, carefully maintained through years of combat, were abandoned in their firing positions, metallic corpses left to American forces who would catalogue them as captured equipment and photograph them for intelligence. Reports, perhaps test them at their own proving grounds. As Weber's group moved through the forest trails, American artillery fire followed them, harassing shoots that suggested forward observers were tracking the withdrawal. The shells were 155mm, landing with the precision that suggested long tom fire. Even in retreat, German forces remained within range of American guns that could reach out 14 miles to strike targets they would never see. They reached German lines after dark, reporting to a division headquarters that was preparing for its own withdrawal. The front was collapsing in sections, defensive lines buckling under pressure that combined massive artillery support with systematic air attack and steady infantry pressure. The German army was still fighting, still inflicting casualties, still conducting local counterattacks. But the overall trajectory was unmistakable. Weber spent that night in a requisitioned farmhouse, writing reports that he suspected no one would read carefully. He documented ammunition expenditure, the handful of shells his guns had fired before spiking. He noted American fire patterns, estimated battery locations, provided what tactical intelligence he could extract from the day's combat. But the reports felt increasingly futile, bureaucratic exercises in a military machine that was grinding to a halt. What stayed with Weber, what occupied his thoughts as he tried to sleep, wasn't the tactical details but the broader implications of what weapons like the long tom represented. The Germans had entered the war believing in their military superiority, better training, better doctrine, better equipment, better soldiers. The early victories had seemed to confirm those beliefs. Poland fell in weeks, France collapsed in months. The Wehrmacht had appeared invincible, a military force that could defeat any enemy through tactical excellence and operational brilliance. But those victories had obscured deeper, to realities. German military excellence was real, but it was excellence within constraints: limited industrial capacity, restricted resource base, geographic encirclement by potential enemies. German weapons were superb products of precision engineering, but that approach didn't scale to mass production in ways that industrial warfare demanded. German tactics were sophisticated, but sophistication couldn't substitute for overwhelming material superiority. The Americans had taken a different path. They'd built an industrial system capable of mass-producing excellent weapons. They'd developed doctrine that leveraged their material strengths rather than trying to match German tactical sophistication. They'd created logistical systems that delivered ammunition, fuel, replacement equipment, and supplies in quantities that made operational calculations fundamentally different than the constrained arithmetic German planners employed. And the long tom, that 14-mile reaching gun that had shocked Hartmann's test crew back in November was just one example of what that approach produced. An excellent weapon, manufactured in quantity, deployed systematically, supported by logistics that ensured ammunition was always available, integrated into doctrine that exploited its capabilities. Not a wonder weapon or a technical miracle, just solid engineering applied at industrial scale. The war would continue for another 3 months. Weber would survive, eventually surrendering to American forces in April when organized resistance in his sector collapsed. But the outcome had already been determined, decided not by any single battle or campaign, but by the cumulative weight of material disparity that weapons like the Long Tom represented. Germany had fought brilliantly with what it had. What it had wasn't enough. The testing facility at Hillersleben fell to Soviet forces in April of 1945. Oberst Klaus Hartmann had evacuated weeks earlier, taking with him what documentation could be carried and destroying the rest. The Long Tom guns captured from American forces remained at the proving ground, along with dozens of other pieces of equipment from every combatant nation, a museum of warfare frozen at the moment of Germany's collapse. Soviet engineers examined the captured American artillery with professional interest, measuring specifications, studying design features, comparing capabilities to their own weapons. They reached conclusions similar to what Hartmann had documented. The Long Tom represented sophisticated engineering, combined with mass production methodology, achieving performance that exceeded Soviet artillery in key measurements. The reports went into Soviet files, influencing post-war artillery development as the Soviet Union absorbed lessons from every weapon system it captured or studied. Hartmann himself survived the war, surrendering to British forces in northern Germany in May. During his captivity, he was interviewed extensively by Allied intelligence officers interested in German assessments of captured equipment. He provided technical details. Willingly, the war was over. Such information no longer held tactical value. What he found difficult to articulate was the psychological dimension of his discoveries. He told one British interviewer in broken English, "Usually we found what we expected: adequate equipment, sometimes good, rarely exceptional. The American gun was different. It performed better than our calculations suggested possible." This was concerning not just for the weapon itself, but for what it implied about our understanding of American capabilities. The interviewer, a Royal Artillery officer who had served in Northwest Europe, nodded. American production capacity wasn't just greater than ours, it operated according to different principles entirely. They'd industrialized warfare in ways we hadn't fully grasped. Hartmann was eventually released and returned to what remained of Germany, a devastated nation divided among the victors, its industry destroyed, its cities in ruins. He found work in reconstruction, using his engineering background to help rebuild what the war had demolished. He never worked in military development again, though he maintained correspondence with former colleagues who entered the new West German defense establishment in the 1950s. In occasional letters to these colleagues, Hartmann would reference the Long Tom tests. The weapon had remained vivid in his memory, not because it was the most powerful gun he'd encountered or the most technologically advanced, but because it represented the moment when certain comfortable assumptions had shattered. "We believed we understood the enemy," he wrote to a former staff officer in 1953. "We had intelligence reports, production estimates, technical assessments, but we interpreted all of it through our own experience, our own industrial limitations. We couldn't imagine that another nation had solved problems we considered insoluble." Major Friedrich Weber's path through post-war Germany was more difficult. He spent 2 years in American captivity, during which time he was extensively debriefed about German artillery doctrine and capabilities. His direct combat experience in Normandy and the Western campaigns made him valuable to American officers, analyzing their own performance and seeking to understand how German forces had fought despite overwhelming material disadvantages. Weber provided detailed accounts of German artillery operations, explaining how gun crews had adapted to American firepower superiority, how forward observers had learned to identify safe positions outside American artillery range, how battery commanders had developed procedures to minimize exposure to counter-battery fire. The Americans listened carefully, taking notes, occasionally challenging his assessments when they contradicted American understanding. During one debriefing session, an American artillery officer showed Weber production figures for the Long Tom, the actual numbers, not the estimates German intelligence had worked with. Over 2,000 guns manufactured between 1941 and 1945. Ammunition production measured in millions of rounds annually. A complete industrial ecosystem, supporting just this one weapon system, factories producing barrels, plants manufacturing shells, facilities loading propellant, transportation networks moving finished weapons to ports for overseas deployment. "We knew you were producing large quantities," Weber said quietly, "but seeing the actual numbers, understanding the complete system, we had nothing comparable, nothing that approached this scale." The American officer nodded. "We did the same thing with everything else: tanks, aircraft, ships, trucks, small arms. The entire military was built on the same principle: design good equipment, then manufacture it in overwhelming quantity." He found work as a surveyor, using his mathematical skills in peaceful application, measuring boundaries rather than calculating firing solutions. He married, raised a family, lived quietly in a small town in what became West Germany. He rarely spoke about the war, though his children later recalled that he seemed uncomfortable around celebrations of German military prowess, dismissive of nostalgic reminiscences about Wehrmacht capabilities. In the 1970s, contacted by a military historian researching American artillery effectiveness in Northwest Europe, Weber agreed to an interview. By then, decades had passed, enough time for perspective, if not complete emotional distance. Artillery, the tactical asymmetries that had made effective defense increasingly difficult. The Long Tom was symbolic, he told the historian. It wasn't the most important weapon, wasn't what decided battles directly, but it represented something we hadn't fully understood, that the Americans had achieved both quality and quantity. We'd assumed those were incompatible, that mass production required sacrificing excellence. We were wrong, and that error cost us dearly. The historian asked whether better German intelligence about American capabilities would have changed anything, whether knowing the true performance of weapons like the Long Tom might have altered German strategy. Weber considered the question carefully before answering. "No," he said finally. "Knowing wouldn't have changed our industrial capacity. Germany couldn't match American production regardless of how well we understood it. Perhaps better intelligence would have led to different tactical decisions, better defensive preparation. But the strategic outcome was determined by material factors that tactical adjustments couldn't overcome." It was a conclusion that many German officers reached in the post-war years. As they analyzed their defeat and attempted to understand what had gone wrong. The comfortable narrative that Germany had been defeated only by overwhelming numbers, that German military excellence had been buried under Allied material superiority, contained truth but was incomplete. The Americans hadn't just outproduced Germany. They'd built better weapons in many categories, developed more effective doctrine in key domains, created more robust logistical systems, trained more capable crews at scale. The Long Tom's 14-mile range became a data point in military textbooks, a specification listed alongside other artillery pieces in comparative tables. But for the men who'd encountered it, who'd tested it at Hillersleben, who'd endured its fire in combat, who'd grasped its implications for the broader military balance, it remained something more significant. A revelation, an uncomfortable truth, a symbol of miscalculation. The weapon itself continued in American service for decades. Long Tom batteries fired in Korea, providing the same long-range fire support they'd delivered in Europe and the Pacific. The guns served into the 1960s before finally being replaced by more modern systems. Many were scrapped, though some survive in museums, their long barrels still pointing toward distant targets they'll never reach again. The Hillersleben Proving Ground, where Hartmann's crew first fired the captured Long Tom in November of 1944, remained a military facility through the Cold War years, operated by Soviet and later Russian forces. The exact spot where that first test round was fired, the location where German assumptions about American artillery began, their collision with reality is unmarked, indistinguishable from the death, surrounding terrain. But the moment itself, the realization it produced, echoes through military history as a cautionary tale about the dangers of mirror imaging, of assuming enemies share your constraints and capabilities. German intelligence had known about American production capacity in abstract terms. What they'd failed to grasp was that American industry operated according to fundamentally different principles than European manufacturing, that it could achieve both scale and quality simultaneously. This wasn't unique to artillery. German intelligence had underestimated American tank production, aircraft manufacturing, shipbuilding capacity, and industrial logistics. In every domain, the pattern repeated: American capabilities exceeded German estimates, not by small margins, but by factors that suggested systematic analytical failure. The human cost of these miscalculations was profound. German soldiers fought with courage and skill, often achieving tactical successes against superior numbers. But they fought within a strategic framework that was fatally flawed from the beginning, a framework that assumed German advantages in training, doctrine, and equipment quality would compensate for Allied material superiority. When weapons like the Long Tom demonstrated that Allied material superiority included technological excellence, the entire calculus collapsed. For men like Weber, who experienced this realization while still fighting, the psychological burden was considerable. Professional soldiers build their identity on competence, on the belief that skill and determination matter, that excellence can overcome obstacles. Discovering that the war's outcome was largely predetermined by industrial disparities that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome challenged their sense of purpose and agency. The broader lesson extended beyond World War II. Modern warfare, the Long Tom suggested, was fundamentally industrial warfare. Victory went to nations that could mobilize comprehensive industrial capacity, that could design for mass production, that could sustain material superiority over extended conflicts. Tactical excellence remained important, but it operated within constraints set by industrial capacity and technological capability. Germany had fought the war. It was prepared to fight a war of maneuver and tactical brilliance, where superior doctrine and professional excellence would achieve quick victories before material factors became decisive. America had fought a different war, a war of industrial attrition, where material advantages would compound over time, where losses could be replaced faster than the enemy could inflict them, where quantity and quality combined to create overwhelming superiority. But it was part of a pattern American capability systematically exceeding German estimates across multiple domains. And patterns matter more than individual data points. They reveal underlying realities that tactical considerations can't change. On that cold November morning in 1944, when Hartmann's crew fired the captured Long Tom for the first time and the observation posts reported impact at 23 kilometers, something shifted in German understanding of the war. Not immediately, not dramatically. Military institutions don't abandon their assumptions easily, but the evidence accumulated, weapon by weapon, battle by battle, until the pattern became undeniable. The Americans weren't just numerous, they were capable. Their weapons weren't just adequate, they were excellent. Their doctrine wasn't just crude firepower. It was sophisticated integration of material advantages with tactical effectiveness. And their industrial system wasn't just larger than Germany's. Kerman guns reached 4 miles, represented more than just distance. It represented the gap between assumption and reality, between what German intelligence believed about American capabilities and what American industry had actually achieved. It represented the difference between fighting the war Germany had prepared for and the war that actually existed. In the end, skill and courage weren't enough. Tactical excellence wasn't enough. Even weapons that were individually superior, like the German 88 in anti-tank roles, weren't enough. The material gap was too wide, the industrial disparity too fundamental, the strategic miscalculation too profound. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.